Daoism and Art. Before your reading week, we read poems by Li Bai and talked about the many different ways in which one could see Taoist influences in his poetry. These included the use of Taoist images and themes in some of the poems we read, as well as some poems which we didn't read, which expressed the Shangqing sect doctrines into which he had been initiated. In today's lesson, we'll be talking about Taoist traditions in Chinese art and visual culture. These will be even more diverse than what we saw last week with Li Bai's poetry, because this week we're not focusing on a single artist, but examining many different kinds of Taoist influence upon a vast variety of Chinese art over the course of centuries. We will be able to see some commonalities among these works of art, but the diversity is at least as important, because Taoism meant something very different to different kinds of artists, some elite and some proletarian, some secular and some religious. What counts as art isn't always obvious. Art doesn't always mean a painting hanging in a museum. And after all, there weren't even any art museums in the modern sense before the 19th century, but there definitely was art. Therefore, there are many different kinds of works and ideas which we need to touch upon in today's lecture. First, we will review the work of art theory which you read for homework. When studying art, it is important to know what artists in a given culture and at a given period thought they were doing and why. After this, the rest of the lecture will be devoted to showing you many examples of Chinese art which has been influenced by Taoist texts, myths, and religious ideas. We will divide this discussion of Taoist art into two different groups: visual culture objects and what I will here call fine art. Visual culture refers to objects which are deliberately designed with strong images or important visual aspects, but which were intended to be part of people's daily lives, or somehow thought of as having a practical or a spiritual function. These may be beautiful and created by great artists, and may now be displayed in museums, but originally they were thought of as useful in addition to being beautiful. For the purposes of this lecture, what I'll be calling fine art is what you might normally think of as art. That is, works which are often expensive, meant primarily for display, having no function other than to express some ideal or narrative in an aesthetically pleasing visual form. Before watching this video, you should already have read the Bifa Ji by Jing Hao. This author was a great landscape artist who lived at the end of the Tang Dynasty. And after the dynasty fell, he moved into the Taihang Mountains to flee the chaos of war, while also farming and painting. Unfortunately, almost all of his paintings have now been lost. The image you see on the right side is one of the very few surviving paintings from Jing Hao. However, Jing Hao was very influential on the course of painting during the following Song Dynasty. And this treatise, the Bifa Ji, remains one of the most influential works of classical Chinese art theory. Now, if you remember the text, most of the actual theory of this text is put into the mouth of the old man whom the author meets in the cave in the Taihang Mountains. But this is obviously fiction. Why didn't Jing Hao just write the same essay, but call it his own idea? Why did he have to put this fictional frame narrative around his core essay? If you look closely, you can see that there are several ways in which the frame story alludes to Taoist phrases and images. There's the wise old man living in the mountains. There's this magical cave, what in the Taoist tradition we call a cave heaven, and which I'll be talking more about later in this lecture. There are the thematic differences between appearance and reality. There are references to classical Taoist texts, such as the phrase, "limitless desire is a threat to life," which is a direct quote from a text called the Huainanzi, which was compiled around the same time as the Zhuangzi and is somewhat related to that text. And then we have the gnarled trees everywhere as well, which are also reminiscent of the many anecdotes about such trees that you find in the Zhuangzi. But more important than any individual image or reference is the overall theme of this text, which is the relationship between painting the outer appearance of a natural scene and getting to the inner truth or inner life of nature. Despite the technical details of the different aspects of painting and advice on brushwork in different situations, in comparison to other early statements theorizing painting, this essay actually downplays technical skill in favor of natural competency. Remember the story of Cook Ding and the ox? This essay is similar. It takes the focus away from mechanical operation and encourages painters to get the feel of the subject that they're working with. Now, in turning from the essay to actual visual examples of Taoist art, let's start with these visual culture objects. Now, the term visual culture is not a term which creators in ancient China would have understood. It's actually a very recently developed academic category to stress the importance of visual references in materials which may not fit into normal conceptions of what counts as art. For today's lecture, we will discuss the following categories of objects as examples of Taoist visual culture: Taoist calligraphy, perfected script, and talismans; astrological, medical, and other diagrams; and tomb art and ritual objects. You may remember from the video lecture on religious Daoism that calligraphy was central to the development of the Shangqing sect. Many early Shangqing leaders were excellent calligraphers. That sect was developing at a time when calligraphy was rapidly developing into an elite art form of its own. An examination of calligraphic styles was also key to the formation of a stable canon of the Yangtze revelations. I think you also might remember the strange perfected script talismans, which I mentioned there was an innovation of the Lingbao sect. Let's start a discussion of Taoist visual culture with another look at this kind of strange perfected script, which you can see here. Sometimes this script contains distorted actual Chinese characters written in a strange style, visually reminiscent of the seal script of the Warring States period, and seeming to lay claim to the authority associated with that ancient look. Now, this image is from a Lingbao scripture originally printed during the Northern Song dynasty, and for which the Song dynasty emperor Huizong wrote a preface, since he was a great fan of calligraphy and also interested in this kind of Taoist perfected script as well. On this next slide, you see an example of perfected script discovered at the fantastic Dunhuang site in western China, which dates to the Hai Tang dynasty. The rest of this manuscript is actually written in normal Chinese characters, but this section is meant to be a transcription of an invocation which Taoist priests would chant during funerals, and which was thought to release the soul from the body and allow it to ascend to heaven. Now here, in the middle of a text which is otherwise written with instructions for the funeral rites in normal Chinese characters, this insertion of the perfected script here for the actual language which the Taoist priest should chant, this is used because it was thought that this strange style of writing could actually capture on the page the primordial energy of the universe, so that when the Taoist priest memorized from this text and then chanted it back during the funeral service, these energies would then be released and more effective in releasing the soul of the departed person. Sometimes, however, perfected script wasn't meant to be read at all, at least not by humans, because it was not a distorted version of standard characters. Symbols like the one you see here were just too crazy and too complicated to have any actual pronunciation or human meaning. Instead, they had a function. They were hung on walls. Sometimes they were hung on the bodies of sick people, or actually, in some cases, compounded into medicine, which people would then swallow. It was thought that this kind of script was so strange that only the gods could read it. And by eating them or hanging them up, one could therefore call the gods to help protect one from illness or misfortune. Taoist calligraphy, though, also extended beyond perfected script. Many of the main values of calligraphic style were influenced by Taoist aesthetics. For example, the value placed on spontaneity and presence in the moment of creation rather than the use of abstracted rules. If some of you have ever tried writing Chinese calligraphy, you'll note it takes a long time to get used to the feel of the brush. Just like Kukding or wheelwright pian, it's not something which you can fully explain to someone how to do. You just have to feel the brush in your hand, feel how it moves, and practice a lot before you can get good at it. In our case, unfortunately, the history of Chinese calligraphic theory is too large, too complex, and too specialized a topic for us to discuss here in this class. Instead, I'll just show you this one example of a highly unusual and very particularly Taoist style called bird script. Now, if you look very closely at this image, you might be able to see some tiny birds incorporated into the brush strokes of these characters. Here's an enlarged view of one of these, a close-up of the word xian, meaning a demigod or immortal being. Do you see the 4 birds perched on top of the 4 vertical strokes? Certain religious mythography created uses for Taoist scripts which incorporated animals into their design. For example, words in which each stroke is actually a dragon, or a fish, or an insect. This particular image is a rubbing from a stone stele designed by the famous Empress Wu Zetian of the Tang Dynasty, and set up in honor of the legendary Taoist saint Wang Ziqiao. Now, it was set up, this stone tablet, at the spot where it was thought that Wang Ziqiao actually ascended to heaven on the back of a white crane. So, most of the words in this work of calligraphy are drawn to include little birds as part of the shorter brushstrokes as a fitting way of commemorating Wang Ziqiao's ascension to heaven on the back of a crane. Now, turning from calligraphy, let's think next about the uses of diagrams, which were often incorporated into Taoist books to illustrate complex concepts and relationships between different ideas. The diagram which you are looking at now is actually a kind of dance chart from a Tang Dynasty text called the Precious Register of the River Chart. Certain medieval Taoist rituals were performed by walking through a certain sequence of steps, during which one imagines oneself to be pacing through the different regions of the sky and meeting deities at each of the different stars and constellations. This image is actually a map of the sky, which shows the location of certain deities to visit. One would move around from one circle to another just by walking through these different positions on the ground, but imagining oneself to be in heaven. So this chart is a kind of map showing exactly how one should walk from one spot to another spot in performing this ritual. Much of Taoist religious practice during the medieval period was focused on determining sets of correspondences between the universe and one's own body. Sometimes different parts of the heavens or the earth were thought to correspond to different parts of the body and to have influence over one's physical and spiritual health. Here on the left side, you can see a chart showing correspondences between stars and different organs of the body. The stars are part of the constellation which in English we call the Big Dipper, though it's actually upside down from the usual Western picture of that constellation. As you can see, each star corresponds to one organ, from left to right being heart, lungs, liver, spleen, stomach, kidneys, and eyes. One common practice was to lie down on a chart of the Big Dipper with closed eyes and imagine each of these organs absorbing energies from one of the 7 stars, a process which would fortify one's health and wisdom. On the right, you see a picture of a mountain, which also maps a system of correspondences onto the body. The labels you see, if you look very closely, aren't the standard names of organs, but they are part of a regular code language of different regions on the body, which is still used in some versions of Chinese medicine to identify different pressure points. Charts like this were important to the practice of what we call inner alchemy, or neidan, by which practitioners were encouraged to visualize and regulate the flows of energy around their body. This was often done in the language of taking a journey through a physical landscape. And this mountain image is provided as a way to visualize that landscape, which one would then imaginatively move through. Here, we have a less geographical chart of the body, also used for the purposes of inner alchemy. This is partially realistic. You can see the spine, kidneys, and bladder very clearly, and there are some slightly more abstracted pictures of heart and lungs. However, there are also weird animal and person-shaped spirits located in this body as well, showing the ways in which this practice of inner alchemy was dependent upon a vision of the working of the body, which was half physical but also half spiritual. On this slide, you can see 2 much more artistic renditions of the same diagram, both from the Qing dynasty. The version on the left is a rubbing from a wooden stele originally set up at White Cloud Temple, or Baiyun Guan, in Beijing. The one on the right is a painting which once belonged to the Qing Palace collection. Both are based on the same earlier, cruder print diagram which you saw in the previous slide. But both of these turn the body back into a landscape of sorts. So here on this next slide is a close-up of the lower belly section of the painting which you saw on the right side just now. On the actual body, the spot just beneath one's navel was called the cinnabar fields, or dantian, and so here you can see this visualized as an actual field, which a farmer is using his ox to plow. In addition to diagrams of the body itself, we sometimes get Taoist diagrams of monsters or of spirits which inhabit the body as parasites. Here, in this diagram of one-legged monsters, the one on the right is thought to be a parasitic spirit which inhabits the groin area. If it gets out of control, it causes excessive lust, weakness, and certain symptoms such as painful urination, which may actually have been the result of sexually transmitted infections. Although traditional medicine did have other ways of dealing with such problems, Taoist priests sometimes were called in to try magic rituals to cure such patients. And then, of course, the most famous diagram of all is the Taiji Tu, or the yin-yang symbol, which has come to represent Taoism. As mentioned during the very first week of the class, The Taiji Tu symbol was not always associated with Daoism and has evolved through many different forms. This image here is a late Ming Dynasty version of the diagram, which associates the relative proportions of yin and yang in different directions, both with the trigrams of the I Ching and also with the different points of the compass. So, for example, the top of the diagram, where the light and sunny force of yang is ascendant, that's associated with the south, while the bottom, in darkness and shadow, is north. And of course, traditional Chinese maps, unlike our modern maps, always placed north downwards and south upwards. Finally, let's move on to the final kind of visual culture object, which I'd like to discuss. Three-dimensional objects which had usages in ritual context or tombs. Here on this slide, you see rubbings of three-dimensional objects from 3 tombs in Sichuan. These tombs were all made during the period of the 2nd to 3rd centuries AD that the Celestial Masters had established a theocratic state in that region. The top image, which was carved above the entrance to one tomb, shows it being guarded by a dragon and a tiger. From sometime in the Han Dynasty, it's known that dragons came to be identified with the Yang principle, and tigers with Yin. And then as Yin-Yang cosmology became incorporated into Taoist religious movements during the medieval period, these dragon and tiger motifs followed along. The middle and bottom images are taken from carvings on the side of sarcophagi in 2 different Sichuan tombs. In the middle image, do you see the strange pattern just above the center, with a circle and 2 triangles on either side, looking a little bit like a bow tie? This is an abstract representation of the headdress of the Queen Mother of the West, or Xi Wang Mu. This Queen Mother of the West was a folk deity of unknown but very early origin. There's a brief reference to her in the Zhuangzi, and there's evidence that she was worshipped much earlier than that. Now, much later in the tradition, she actually becomes central to Taoist religious practice, but even here, with this sarcophagus and the same image inscribed on other tombs, we have good evidence that the Queen Mother of the West was already being worshipped by the Celestial Masters. The rest of the middle sarcophagus seems to be depicting a visit to the underworld. On the left side is a god figure. He is seated on a throne, again with a dragon and tiger carving. The great scholar of Chinese art, Wu Hong, has identified the short figure with a staff in the middle, just under the headdress design, as a Celestial Master's priest. And then this same priest also appears on the bottom image to the center left. Note that in both images, the priest is also accompanied by a deer. We don't know enough about Celestial Masters' myths of the afterlife to know what the deer is doing here, but we can surmise that this must somehow have been a standardized image related to Celestial Masters' myths of the afterlife. Even though we can't interpret them completely, these funerary images show us very clearly how studies of Taoist visual culture aren't just about appreciating the aesthetics of the religion. They can also give us important clues as to what various Taoist sects believed. In this case, we can also map out the geographical distribution of these tombs that have Taoist imagery during the period, and that gives us a clearer idea of exactly how much territory the Celestial Masters' kingdom controlled during the late 2nd century, and then later how far their beliefs spread at each time period. On the next slide, we can take a look at a couple of different and much later objects. These are from over 1,200 years after the rise of the Celestial Masters. On the left here, you see 2 Ming Dynasty examples of Taoist ritual swords. The sword on the left has an inscription on seal script on the grip, which makes it clear that this was a gift from the emperor to an important Taoist priest. The hilt of the sword and the blade itself are also inscribed with diagrams of the Big Dipper. The sword on the right has indecipherable perfected script on the blade, as well as an augmented Big Dipper diagram. Swords like these were used for religious rituals, and in fact one can still purchase swords with similar inscriptions on the blades for use in Tai Chi sword training. These swords were never used in actual combat, but there has always been an association of them with magical forces. And traditional martial arts novels, and more recently films and video games, have often talked about Taoist swords like these as being used to give martial arts trained Taoist priests unbeatable power in combat. On the right is an example of the reverse side of a Taoist mirror. Often, Taoist mirrors were covered in the reverse with magical symbols and thought to have powers to heal or bless those who looked into them. Those of you who have read the classic novel Hong Lo Meng, or Dream of the Red Chamber, may remember the early chapter in which a Taoist priest gives a magic mirror to Jia Rui to cure him of his lust. There were actually such mirrors which one could buy, though it's doubtful that any of them did have magical powers. This mirror may have been more decorative than magical. The scene on the reverse shows a story about an adventure in a cave heaven. Taoist stories of caves and the magical beings which lived there were incredibly popular. Remember that the basic narrative of the Bifa Ji, which you read for today, also begins with that story of the author's discovery of a huge cave with amazing sights inside which he wants to paint. The water curtain cave, or Shui Lian Dong, at the beginning of the novel Journey to the West, where Sun Wukong and his magic monkey subjects all lived, is another good example of one of these cave heavens. On this slide, you see examples of so-called money trees. It isn't exactly known what these objects were used for, but scholars' current best guess is that they were simply placed in the home as good luck objects. To some degree, they were thought of likely as having the ability to attract money, but since the celestial masters weren't big fans of chasing after money, it's probably the case that they were usually invoked to bring more kinds of generalized blessings upon the home. Here is a detail from a mural on the wall of a temple in Shanxi province, and you can see a Taoist priest's robe decorated with images of the islands of the immortals. These may be intended to represent Penglai, the islands mentioned in our Li Bai poems. Our own McTaggart collection does have several examples of Taoist priests' robes used for ceremonies at the Qing Dynasty royal court. Those examples which are in our university's collection don't have pictures of these islands on them, but they do have intricate designs and complex meanings woven in. Now, let's turn to the kind of images that people usually think of as art: high-quality paintings and sculptures. There is not an absolute line between this kind of art and visual culture. We'll start by discussing one category of art, religious iconography, which has always been considered as fine art, yet which also clearly has a function in promoting religious worship practices, not unlike some of the ritual objects we've already seen. But with that caveat in mind, let's consider the following categories of art in this section. First, hagiographic portraiture and religious icons. Second, representations of famous Taoist literary texts. And then finally, landscape painting. One of the most common ways in which fine art interacts with religion is through religious iconography. This is utterly common across the world. For example, consider the centrality which images such as paintings and statues of Jesus or Mary or various saints have in the history of European art. Taoist religions are similar. There is a great deal of elite art which depicts the gods and saints of Taoist belief, as well as depicting certain scenes or ideas. This slide and the next three depict scenes from a hand scroll explaining the steps involved in the meditation practice of inner alchemy, with illustrations drawn from the practice of outer alchemy, by which Taoists tried to manipulate chemicals to produce elixirs of immortality. In these, you can see some Taoist immortals pictured on the illustrations. These are not meant as actual idols to worship, but they are drawn very much in the style of such paintings as they appear in Taoist temples. On this slide, you see 4 different pictures of Zhang Daoling, the founder of the Celestial Masters sect. Remember that Zhang was not merely considered a respected religious leader in the Celestial Masters religion, he was actually thought to be one of the incarnations of the Tao, just like Lao Tzu was. Now, when looking at these 4 different images, first, think about the similarities. In all of them, he's given pretty unruly hair and a beard from all across the 4 portraits. His hands are clasped together. He's always wearing a certain kind of robe, presumably that worn by the Celestial Masters' priests. And he's given a very forbidding expression. And then in 2 of the paintings on the left side, he is depicted with a halo, a convention parallel to that of European art in the Middle Ages, but which in this case has been borrowed from Buddhist art, and which marks him very clearly as a saint. But in addition to the similarities, consider the differences which you see in drawing style and in coloration, the medium of the art, some are painted versus drawn or printed, the background or lack of background, and the position of the body. Think for yourself, what might be the reasons for these differences? Is one of these images more likely to have been used in a worship setting? Is one of them more likely to have been from a painting hanging on the wall of a wealthy, culturally elite politician? You don't have to know the exact answer to these questions. I won't put this on the exam. I just want you to think about the question. What criteria would you use to make the right decision about what representations mean and how they might be suited to different contexts? Here you see 3 different paintings which are also close to use in religious worship. On the left is a Ming Dynasty painting of a god called the Emperor of Purple Tenuity, or Ziwei Dadi. This was one of the most powerful gods in the Taoist pantheon. Notice that he's dressed in clothing very similar to that which a mortal emperor would wear, and also surrounded by divine servants to attend to him, just like a real emperor would have around him. Depictions of heaven in Chinese Taoist texts were often very hierarchical and mirrored the structure of earthly ruling courts. In the middle, you see a picture of Duke Guan or Guanggong, which was painted during the early Qing dynasty. Unlike many Taoist deities, this actually was originally a real person named Guan Yu, who was a general for the kingdom of Shu in the wars following the collapse of the Han dynasty. For reasons that scholars still do not fully understand, Guan Yu became an object of worship within a few centuries after his death, and he remains worshipped to this day, often being thought of as a god of war, or a fierce advocate of justice, and a killer of evil spirits. He has never been exclusively a Taoist deity. He was originally worshipped in local folk cults, and he still has shrines to this day that aren't Taoist per se. But Daoism has adopted him into its own pantheon, and this happened by about the Song dynasty. Notice here that he is depicted wielding a large halberd. This is a typical identifying feature of his. Finally, on the right, you see a 20th century painting from a Taoist temple on Taiwan, which is done in classical style and depicting an earthly Taoist priest kneeling at the gates of heaven to submit petitions on behalf of the people, which are in the community that he serves. This subject for a picture likely serves to create in worshippers a trust in their own local priest, as it emphasizes his role in helping them bring their prayers to heaven. Here you see two statues of the deified Lao Tzu, which almost certainly were used as religious icons for worship. These date to the northern dynasties, which were controlled by non-Chinese people from the 4th to the 6th centuries AD. This was a high point for religious statuary, especially in Buddhist art. Note that in both statues, Lao Tzu is flanked by two attendants, suggesting that by this period he is already seen as a kind of emperor in heaven. Now, let's contrast those statues of Lao Tzu with this painting of him, and turn away from explicitly religious uses of Taoism to more literary approaches. This painting is one of the most famous paintings of Lao Tzu, painted by Zhang Lu of the Ming Dynasty, and showing Lao Tzu riding an ox on his way out of China to the West, as one common legend held he did at the end of his life. He's looking up at a bat, a symbol of prosperity. Notice that this painting shows Lao Tzu as an interesting old man in a very human pose. He's not sitting upright and majestic, as in the two statues shown on the last slide. That is because this work was not meant to hang in a temple for worshippers. It was a kind of art as we think of art, something that you would hang upon a wall to beautify a room. And by the number of red square chop impressions that you can see on the top and on the left side of this painting, we can tell that this painting did actually pass through the hands of a number of wealthy art collectors. This next painting also dates to the Ming Dynasty and is by Lu Zhi. Now, as you might be able to guess from the butterflies just over the head of this sleeping man, this is intended to depict Zhuangzhou. This painting is from an album of pictures, which a collector would have kept in a library. Zhuangzhou was also often worshipped as a god in Taoist religions, but this portrait is obviously not meant to depict him that way. Instead, it is a gentle, humorous take on the story of the butterfly dream, appropriate for an elite and cultured literary collector. An even less religious and more literary version of a Taoist painting is this work, the only surviving work by Yuan Dynasty painter Zhou Dongqing. The title of this work is The Pleasure of Fishes. That, plus a short poem at the end of the scroll by the painter, are the only elements here that mark it as Taoist. It is an allusion to the story from the Zhuangzi about Zhuangzhou and Huishi standing by the stream and debating whether they can know if the fish are happy. Here, the title tells us that they are happy, but it also adds the association with Zhuangzi's philosophical lesson, making us, as viewers of the painting, in effect parallel to Zhuangzhou and Huishi as they stood above the stream looking at the fish. Without any title, this would be a nicely painted, but perhaps boring painting of a few fish. But with the contextualization, we are asked to question our own relationship to the painting and to think about how we can know the meaning of a visual scene such as this. Finally, let's look at a few landscape paintings and think about how these can be Taoist. Landscape paintings are probably the most famous form of Chinese art outside of China, and many non-Chinese art lovers are familiar with images of tiny figures lost in the landscapes of impossibly steep-seeming mountains. Landscape painting has its own traditions, and there are many styles and themes in the history of Chinese landscape painting, and certainly not all of those works are Taoist in any meaningful way. But we can look at a few ways in which Taoist ideologies have influenced some works of landscape art. We can start with this painting by Lu Guang from the Ming Dynasty, titled Spring Dawn at the Cinnabar Terrace. Cinnabar, or Dan, was an ingredient in Taoist alchemy, and it is a word commonly seen in all kinds of Taoist texts. Scholars think that this particular painting is meant to evoke an association with the spiritual cinnabar of so-called inner alchemy or neidan practices. It's likely that this painting depicts one spot on Mount Mao, near Nanjing. Remember, this is the same mountain which became the center of the Shangqing sect from the period of Tao Hongjing. The terrace of the title can be seen in the enlarged section to the right, on the cliff just above the monastery. You can see there's a tiny railing running around the edge of the cliff. Equally important to the painting itself is the inscription by the painter at the top, which speaks of his traveling for years beyond the social world. Now he has come to this mountain and discusses painting and literature with the Taoist saints who are living there. This is a very literary ideal of pure talk, or qingtan, which is being referenced, and which has its roots in earlier medieval Taoist intellectual circles. Here, part of the pleasure of entering into a landscape like this is meeting with other minds, who have also realized the emptiness of the social world and have left it behind to come here, experience nature, and talk with a few like-minded travelers about the truth of the world. Here in this next work, you see a painting titled Seeking the Tao in a Cavern Heaven by the early Ming master Daoism. As mentioned previously in regard to the scene on the back of the magic mirror, caverns are very important in Taoist mythologies. There are many stories of Taoist saints finding these caves, and they are also linked to the practices of inner alchemy, envisioning relations between one's body and the landscape. In fact, the magic caves are so important to Taoism that the Taoist canon, or Daozang, a massive compendium of dozens and dozens of huge volumes of Taoist writings, called its different sections cave heavens. In this painting, notice how Daoism uses the odd angles of the landscape to suggest the mysteriousness of the cavern heaven. At first glance, one might notice only the strange rocks and trees common to Chinese landscape paintings. In the close-up, you can see that the Taoist hermit is heading into a small opening. But look at the angles here. The cave mouth would be invisible from most directions. Even from our viewpoint, we can barely see inside and have to wonder what is past the mouth of the cave. And where could that cave be going to anyway? It isn't actually heading into a mountain. Instead, it leads apparently into empty space. Although the signs of nature fill the length of the scroll, at its very center we have a picture of a space that appears supernatural. Here we have two paintings that are much more direct in painting the supernatural. On the left is a painting from the Ming Dynasty by an unknown artist, which depicts the visit of King Mu of the ancient Zhou Dynasty, roughly 1000 BC, visiting the Queen Mother of the West in her home on Mount Kunlun. In accordance with the various versions of the myth, you can see the tents of King Mu's entourage at the bottom of the painting. He is inside the court with the Queen Mother of the West and is allowed to sit in her presence, but is seated on a small stool, and she seems to be on a higher throne, indicating his respected but inferior status as a king coming to seek wisdom of a goddess. On the right side is a much grander vision of the ethereal palace of the Queen Mother of the West, done in what is called blue-green style, from the bright turquoise paint used here. Blue-green style was popular for many kinds of landscapes at different periods. Here, the fact that this color is primarily reserved for the mountains, which form a kind of rock wall around the palace, suggests its exotic distance from the normal world. We are also viewing this palace at a special time, when the peaches of immortality are being harvested on the lower right of the painting. These peaches only grow once every 3,000 years. Those of you who have read Journey to the West, or COT, will also remember Sun Wukong getting in trouble for stealing those same peaches. Finally, let's look at a painting in which Taoist philosophy seems to have influenced not just what is painted, but how it is painted. This is a 10th century painting by a Buddhist monk named Juran, but the title is Seeking the Tao in the Autumn Mountains. And it is common for Buddhists and Taoists to be influenced by each other during this period. The person actually seeking the Tao is an almost invisibly tiny traveler sitting in the building in the lower center of the painting. Rather than focusing on him, though, look at the mountain itself, and particularly look at the brushwork and the lines of the mountain. Unlike some mountains in many Chinese landscapes, these ones here are not pointy or craggy. Instead, they're like a series of smooth stones piled up. And the brushwork on these smooth stones is also smooth. The lines for each stone flow downward, all together in the same direction. If we did not know that these were meant to be stones, we might think that these are actually not stone, but water flowing down in so many waterfalls. And this seems to be the point of the painting. The Tao always flows like water. And here we can see the natural qi flowing through the landscape and making even a solid rocky mountain appear like a river. Here we can really find the Tao literally in the autumn mountains, not just among them. Conclusions. There are many different forms of art and visual culture throughout China's history that were influenced by Taoism in different ways. We saw forms of writing used to communicate divine secrets, objects and pictures intended to educate people about Taoist doctrine, objects and images used in religious worship ceremonies, representations of Taoist saints and sages to encourage believers, representations of famous Taoist texts for elite cultural consumption, and decorative and aesthetically ambitious landscape art which references Taoist visions of nature. This diversity of art requires a diversity of ways of looking at and interpreting the same art according to context. One wouldn't want to interpret a statue of Lao Tzu in a Taoist temple used for worship the same way that one interpreted a painting of Lao Tzu meant to hang in the library of a wealthy collector. Therefore, these materials also give us the opportunity to think about the relationship of religious belief to visual art in different ways.